I'm quite close to this one, so let's see if I can keep a cool head as I discuss this. I hope that it's clear by now that my principal core motivation stems from a desire to see individuals following their own path, happy and indeed comforted in the knowledge that others are also following the path that is right for them. That's my utopia, my perfect ideal world. Actual religious freedom. Each individual fulfilling their higher purpose, which can never happen with a one-size-fits-all spiritual system. And that includes my system, by the way. All right. Am I suggesting here that all religions are A-OK and religious groups that promote violence, for example, should be encouraged and held with the same kind of esteem as those that promote peace? Obviously, I'm not. And in fact, let me be clear here and state on the record that I believe that organized religions are one of our world's biggest problems. Now, as you know, because I've regularly mentioned it on my videos, I consider myself a follower of Jesus's teachings. I think of his teachings, not Paul's teachings, mind you, or Irenaeus's teachings, or Thomas Aquinas's teachings. No, I consider the teachings attributed to Jesus of Nazareth to be my guiding compass whenever I need help working out what's right and wrong. I believe that Jesus died pointing out the failures of organized religion and attempting to give us an alternative. And I believe that Christianity itself is one of the biggest betrayals of what Jesus was trying to do. That's my opinion. I'll say that again, and just in case it didn't quite sink in, I believe, so I'm not stating an objective, tangible truth here that I think that you should believe as well. I'm just telling you what I've concluded from experience and research. You're watching my video, so I think it's only fair that I should tell you that so that you know where I'm coming from. I also consider that you have the right to believe whatever you choose to believe. Well, my belief is that organized religion is a barrier to spirituality, not an aid to it. Spirituality sometimes happens in spite of organized religion. I certainly can't deny that, but organized religions are first and foremost political tools, not spiritual ones. And they close far more doors for the spiritual seeker than they open. I'm speaking from observation and from personal experience. I repeat, I'd never try to prevent anyone from believing otherwise if it makes more sense to them. So, now that my position on that is hopefully clear, let's continue. If you've seen the very first Esoteric Saturday video that I ever made, the first thing that you'll know is that I've aged quite a bit in just 4 years, and the other thing that you'll know is that I wasn't brought up a Christian, but that I switched from being an atheist to having an active spiritual life because of certain events and experiences which left me with no doubt, in the same way as I've no doubt that the sun and the moon are real things. First-hand experience does that, I guess. I simply followed the instructions for an experiment that ended up working, and I drew a conclusion. The techniques I tried that were so successful and that permitted me to make a connection with the divine were the techniques that Jesus of Nazareth proposes in the Gospel. I tried his ridiculously simple method that's outlined in Matthew chapter 6 verses 5 to 8, and it worked. Now that experience was life-changing for me. I was an atheist and I was suddenly having this first-hand experience of the divine. Notice that I'm not using the word God. This wasn't the daddy-in-the-sky God that most atheists imagine and that most followers of other religions imagine, and let's be honest, that even most people who call themselves Christians imagine. That egregore to end all egregores. You know the one, the control freak who'll smite you if you fall in love with a person with the wrong genitalia, or who'll happily condemn a soul to eternal suffering for belonging to the wrong club. Because that's what most people instinctively think of when we say the word God in the context of the Bible, isn't it? Some kind of specialized super spirit, like a spirit line manager, right? What I experienced was the mind source. What Aldous Huxley calls mind at large. It didn't know me because it had superpowers to read my mind. It knew me because I was a part of it. In its image, so to speak. Clearly and obviously life-changing. So naturally I became a fan of Jesus' teachings. And I thought to myself, well, should I meet up with other fans of Jesus' teachings? People who call themselves Christians, right? And so I did. I went to church after church looking for other people who'd also be fans of Jesus' teachings. But all that I found were people who were fans of Jesus. For crying out loud, they were even praying to and worshipping Jesus. Jesus who told people that the kingdom of heaven is within, who told people that the laws of the Old Testament should be used to benefit mankind and not vice versa. And I realized that there was almost no overlap, no crossover between what I had experienced and what I believe Jesus was in fact teaching on the one hand, and what these people who called themselves Christians believed and what they did and what they considered important on the other hand. I mean, the guy was crucified for speaking out against the legalese and hypocrisy and vainglory of organized religion, of institutions that codify and regulate and standardize what God is and what God says and how God wants us to act. Organized religion is a political product. People who approach them looking for spiritual guidance mostly come away with nothing but a head full of fears and an excuse to go to war. And then I read Meister Eckhart, who said, "He who seeks God under settled forms lays hold of the form while missing the God concealed in it." And I thought, maybe there are some Christians who get it after all. Maybe the problem is the label. What's the difference between Meister Eckhart, who's clearly pointing to an actual experience of God, and say, forgive me, but a moron like St. Augustine who spends his life just failing over and over again to describe the indescribable, to capture the rules and reasons of divinity by using logic of all the inadequate tools for the job, because, well, one gets it and the other clearly doesn't. And they both call themselves Christians. And yes, I did encounter this primal ground, let's call it that, why not, thanks to the instructions attributed to Jesus of Nazareth. So you could say that, sure enough, I'm pitching the Christian God against all the others. But here's the thing, as much as I do believe that this thing I encountered is precisely what Jesus was pointing at with his teachings, I also believe that it's not the God that most Christians worship. In fact, following this experience, I believe that Jesus would have wanted nothing to do with organized religion, or with any clubs or labels for that matter, because what I encountered can't be the property of one group of people. It's common not just to all people, but to all existing beings, in the same way as gravity is. And it's not something that anyone needs permission to reach out to, because obviously, if there's such a thing as an origin of mind, then it's going to be applicable to anyone who has a mind. And considering how most people think about our minds nowadays, a vast majority are even going to choose to dismiss that such a thing can even exist. But having experienced it, my natural conclusion is that we are all of it. So to call it Christian is absolutely incorrect. It's universal, and that's why it appealed to me so much, was because it was obviously to me universal. And the thing that became apparent to me was precisely that anyone, regardless of their culture or background or social status or education or language or nationality or gender or sexuality or race or ability, necessarily had access to this source by default if only they tried. And so, no, this numinous encounter that I'd had couldn't possibly be exclusive to Christianity. It's like the pyramids that appear in many cultures. Well, it's the most stable structure. It's the most stable structure in Egypt and is the most stable structure in Mexico. It doesn't matter where you stand or what your background is or what club you belong to. The most stable structure is the most stable structure, and people all over the world are going to work it out and use it. They don't need to have shared information. Well, to me it was obvious that the source of mind was the source of mind, and that clearly people around the world in different places and from different cultures are going to work that out and probably codify it in different ways. Give it different names, sure. Now, this isn't the same as saying my club's God and your club's God are the same thing. No, most clubs have very specialized entities at their heads. Gods. This is the right term for what these entities are. They are gods. And to suggest that they're all one God is clearly ridiculous. Now, incidentally, I do believe that the God described in the first 5 books of the so-called Old Testament, or the Torah, the God who led the Hebrews out of slavery and the Egyptians to their deaths, was a God, the head of a club, an entity who can declare itself to be jealous and closer to one group of people than to another. And that is indeed what most people who call themselves Christians consider to be their God. But that's not what I encountered, and that's why I don't like to call the thing that I did encounter God or a God, because that would be misleading, just incorrect. I encountered the stuff of which minds are made, something that was impossible to be exclusive to one group of people. So naturally, my assumption was that if I dug deep enough into the philosophies and religions of other locations and times, I should find hints of people encountering this same thing. Well, sure enough, I did. And the pattern that was emerging was that it was the mystic, esoteric factions of all these religions that seemed to focus on this encounter with the universal numinous, and that these people weren't usually particularly appreciated by the overwhelming majority of people declaring themselves to be the real followers of that religion. But invariably, amid all the saber-rattling and triumphalism that our God is better than your God, there they'd be, small groups of people who are clearly talking about the same stuff as whatever it was that I'd encountered. Christianity clearly had its own little group, Meister Eckhart, St. Francis of Assisi, Thomas Keating, Pascal, of course, but then I started to research Islam, and sure enough, there were the Sufis, Rumi and Kabir, saying things like, Benares is to the east, Mecca is to the west, but explore your own heart, for there are both Rama and Allah. And then I came upon Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, which actually opens with the words, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of 10,000 things. This was it. I'd encountered the nameless. Whereas religions endlessly discussed and debated and fought over and killed and died over the named, the thing that arises when we try to encompass the nameless in settled form, when we try to tell it, describe it, point to its attributes. So then I went from one religion to the next, seeking out their mystics who were all talking about the same thing. But in the meantime, of course, I also learnt about the mainstream, exoteric aspects of those religions, which I found fascinating, but just of a completely different order. I'd almost go as far as to say that it was unrelated, almost unrelated anyway. All of these deities were aspects of the primal ground in exactly the same way as you and I are aspects of this primal ground. And I've talked about this before, so I'll leave a link to that down below if you're interested. Well, the next place my research took me was Aldous Huxley. His description and later analysis of his experience under laboratory conditions with 0.4 of a gram of mescaline in his book, The Doors of Perception, resonated very deeply with what I'd experienced. Sidelining, almost an erosion of identity and of individuality, resulting in a union with the source of his mind's essence, like a drop of water returning to the ocean and simultaneously disappearing, and also realizing that the whole time it had been a part of something unfathomably larger than it had imagined itself to be. And then I discovered Dennis Genpo Merzel's trademarked big mind technique, of which I shared an adapted version on my channel, which allowed people to experience this firsthand without narcotics. And then I discovered that there was a group of people who explicitly were investigating the same thing as I was. They called themselves Perennialists. Okay, time to get out the red flags. Anyone who has watched the video that Dan Attrell and my good friend Dr. Justin Sledge made together, called The Dark Side of Perennialism, will probably be getting nervous at this point. I mean, unless you actually listen to what they were saying and also to what I've been saying, in which case hopefully you'll already know that their take on perennialism is quite far removed from the experience I've just described to you. Now, I want to say from the outset here that I have absolutely nothing but respect for Dan Attrell, who recently translated the Picatrix, for example, and I count Dr. Sledge as a good friend. What I'm talking about today concerns neither Dan nor Justin's character, nor the rigor of their research, both of which are, in my opinion, impeccable. And in fact, you'd do very well to go and subscribe to both their YouTube channels if you haven't done so already. But those videos were about Marsilio Ficino and his student Pico della Mirandola, not about perennialism, in my opinion. And I'm sorry, describing perennialism by the actions of these two individuals is like describing Islam through the actions of Osama bin Laden or Christianity through the actions of the Spanish Inquisition. This is what invariably happens when spirituality is confused with politics. The perennialists that I was reading were Aldous Huxley. I believe I proudly produced my copy of the first edition of his book, The Perennial Philosophy, as the most important book on my shelves during that crossover interview that we did with Dr. Sledge about a year ago now. I was also reading Houston Smith and Sayed Hossein Nasr. All of these were authors who were clearly speaking the same language as I was, who had clearly had similar experiences to my own, and who were also investigating the same kinds of areas in the many religions of the world. I considered this useful because it allowed me to learn the language, the words that other cultures used to talk about this most difficult to talk about topic. My objective, and the objective of those authors I just mentioned, was to build bridges, to have the language necessary to refute the xenophobia that I was seeing all around me, to reassure anyone who would listen that they didn't need to be afraid of those bad people with their different religion, that there was common ground between people of all cultures, and that what was universal was what was essential. But unfortunately, there are always going to be bigots out there, people who see this message to mean that what is not universal is therefore disposable. And that, of course, was the problem with Ficino and della Mirandola. There's a problem with the language here. The word essential, which is a Latin origin word from the Latin essentia, essence, means two things, doesn't it? The core meaning of the word is pertaining to or constituting the essence of a thing. And this is the meaning of the word that's appropriate here. The essence of the big five world religions is universal. But there's the other meaning of the word essential, isn't there? Which is in fact a metaphor, but it's actually the meaning that most people associate with that word nowadays. And actually, if you look the word up in a dictionary, you'll find that this is the first definition that comes up because of how popular that meaning is. And that is that something that is essential means that it's indispensable. And here the trouble starts. What's the opposite of indispensable? That's right, dispensable. So the message gets perverted to say that whatever isn't universal is therefore dispensable. Ficino and della Mirandola were, unfortunately, of that opinion. Now, I see labels in the same light as I see organizations, to be honest. Meaningless words that invariably mean different things to different people, and that are ultimately mostly useful for justifying fights, and in some cases mass slaughter. I'm an ABC, so I think this. I'm an XYZ, so I think that. Except when I don't. But I should, because I'm an XYZ, and XYZs are never wrong. So no, I take it back. I don't think differently, because then I'd be betraying my identity that is contained in the XYZ manifesto. Pardon my French, but bollocks. Labels are of the same stuff as organized religions. In fact, they're one of their most devastatingly potent tools. Stay with us or the ABCs will get you. It's all tribal, us against them stuff, and I just don't have time for it. But the Perennialist label was one label that I didn't hate. So you can imagine how I felt when I saw that video that was basically defining perennialism through the colonialist lens, painting it essentially as Nazism in disguise. But on the other hand, I am grateful to Dan and Justin for pointing out this weakness in what I consider to be essentially a philosophy that helped me make sense of the world in a constructive way at a time when I could just as easily have become a fundamentalist Christian. I'm grateful because I obviously care about this philosophy, and if it has the potential to be perverted, that should be made evident and clear and well known so that perversion never goes unnoticed or unchecked, or, worst possible situation, condoned or ignored. And what I think of as a ray of hope for others who find themselves in the same crossroads as I found myself 25 years ago doesn't get entirely lost to the warmongers.